The first thing you would notice, if you ever found yourself transported into the heart of the Wild West, was not the gun smoke or the sound of galloping hooves, but the silence. A silence so heavy it pressed down on the chest like a stone. The kind of silence broken only by the sigh of the wind against brittle sagebrush and the faint groan of a wooden sign swinging on rusted hinges outside a forgotten station. And if you stood there too long, you might come to understand why most travelers never lingered in one place without reason. Because the land itself felt endless, merciless, and hungry, as though it waited for you to make a single mistake before swallowing you whole. The train station was hardly more than a platform nailed together from sun-bleached planks, the iron rails stretching into the horizon, shimmering under the heat. And the only people around were the station master, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks who looked like he had been carved from the desert stone itself, and a sleeping dog curled in the shade of a barrel, its ribs showing through its dusty fur. And though this seemed uneventful, it was exactly the kind of quiet beginning that masked the chaos and danger of the West. Because every town, no matter how small or seemingly harmless, had its secrets, its crimes, and its fragile balance between order and lawlessness. Stepping down from the train meant stepping into a place where survival was measured in ounces of water, where trust was more valuable than gold, but rarer than honesty, where the law was as shifting as the sand dunes, and justice was often drawn from the barrel of a revolver. And if you thought you could stroll in with your city clothes and modern sense of safety, you would last less than a day. Because the desert did not care about fairness, it cared only about endurance. And endurance came from knowledge, from preparation, and from an understanding that everything here, from the rattlesnake under the rock to the smile of the bartender, could be a trap. The stagecoach that had left earlier in the morning carried with it not just passengers, but whispers, stories of robberies on the trail, of missing cattle herds, of strangers shot in the back and left face down in the dust. And the station master, though he said nothing, had eyes that hinted at memories he would never speak of. And perhaps he knew that the arrival of any new traveler could bring either fortune or ruin to a town already teetering between prosperity and decay. Because the Wild West, despite its romantic legends, was not a land of heroes and clean duels at high noon, but a place of hunger, greed, betrayal, and desperate survival, where boredom could be broken at any moment by the crack of a rifle from behind a ridge or the sudden disappearance of a horse in the night. And as you adjusted to the slow rhythm of the place, your throat already dry from the thin air, you might begin to understand that boredom was a luxury here, a dangerous illusion, because every calm moment meant that somewhere nearby a storm was gathering, whether in the form of a dust cloud or the festering resentment of a man who had lost too much to ever forgive. And it was in that uneasy space between silence and violence that the real story of the West unfolded. In the long afternoons, where the heat shimmered on the horizon, in the creak of saddles as riders passed without a word, in the sudden shouts from the saloon when a poker hand turned bloody, and in the endless nights when coyotes howled under the cold gaze of the moon and travelers lay awake wondering if the shadow, moving just beyond the firelight, was only an animal, or something much worse, something human, carrying the weight of desperation, of hunger, of crime. Because in the West, Crime was not always a choice, but often the only means of living another day. And if you had been there, standing on that platform as the train vanished into the desert, you might have felt it too, the pull of both sleep and danger, the strange lull of a world so vast and slow that it felt safe, until suddenly it wasn't, until the silence itself turned into the sound of approaching boots, the sharp click of a revolver's hammer, and the certainty that in this place, survival was not just about water and shelter, but about knowing when to stand still, when to walk away, and when to draw your weapon before someone else did. The sheriff of this forgotten town was not the iron-jawed hero sung about in dime novels, but a weary figure, half hidden beneath the brim of a sun-stained hat, his badge no brighter than the tarnished brass buckle on his belt. And though he wore it each day pinned against his vest, he carried it less as a symbol of power and more as a reminder of duty that pressed upon him like the desert heat, heavy, relentless, and always present. For he had not come west seeking glory or law. He had come west chasing silence, a chance to outpace debts and memories from another life. But the silence of the desert had turned into responsibility when no one else dared to shoulder it. And so he became sheriff in name, if not in strength, a reluctant guardian of a place that mocked the very idea of order. His office was a leaning shack near the livery, its window rattling in every gust of wind, its desk covered not with neat reports, but with scraps of paper scrawled in uneven ink, each note a record of thefts unanswered, robberies unpunished, murders unsolved, a ledger of defeat that he sometimes stared at until the words blurred and the weight of failure pressed against his chest. So hard, he thought his ribs might crack. And yet each morning he pinned the badge to his vest again, stepped into the light of a sun that burned without mercy, and walked the dust-choked street with a rifle across his back, because the people, poor and stubborn, still needed to see someone carrying the burden, even if that burden was too great for any one man. The jailhouse attached to his office was little more than 2 rusted cages, one door jammed so badly it would never shut, the other lined with bars so warped a determined drunk could slip through. And more than once he had dragged men into those cells only to wake before dawn and find them gone, slipped away into the desert or freed by friends with quicker guns. And so he stopped expecting cells to hold anyone for long, relying instead on words, warnings, and the thin thread of his presence to keep the peace, though he knew peace in this town was nothing but a pause between storms. In the saloon, when the lamps burned low, he sometimes sat with his hat pulled over his brow, sipping whiskey slowly, not for pleasure, but for the fire it gave him in his chest, a fire he needed to face the endless night patrols, the endless waiting for the inevitable sound of boots rushing down the street. For he understood that his enemies were not only the gangs who robbed stagecoaches or the rustlers who stripped ranches bare. His enemies were also hunger, thirst, greed, loneliness, each of them gnawing at the people, until desperation made outlaws of men who had once been farmers, blacksmiths, fathers, and though he sometimes dreamed of leaving selling his horse, abandoning the badge, vanishing into the horizon, he remained, because departure would mean surrendering the town to the wolves circling it, wolves both human and wild, and he could not let himself be remembered as the sheriff who fled. Children followed him with wide eyes as he walked, not because they admired him, but because they sensed in him a fragile line between safety and chaos. And mothers nodded politely when he passed, though behind their nods was doubt. For they knew his badge could not stop a bullet, could not return a stolen son, could not bring justice to graves marked only by crooked stones on the hill beyond town. Yet still they wanted him there, because an imperfect guardian was better than no guardian at all. At night, lying on the narrow cot in his office, he often kept one hand resting near the revolver on the table, his ears straining to separate the sigh of the wind from the sound of a boot scraping the street, his mind replaying every threat he had heard, every name muttered in anger, every promise of vengeance that lingered in the smoke-filled saloon. And he wondered how many nights he had left before one of those promises found him in the dark. And yet, when the rooster cried at dawn and the desert flared gold again, he rose, washed his face in the cracked basin, and stepped back into the dust with his rifle. Because survival in the West was not about triumph, but about endurance. About rising each day even when the land itself seemed determined to bury you. And in that stubborn rising, in the slow, steady rhythm of his boots against the boardwalk, there was a strange poetry, a defiance that whispered to the town that law, however fragile, was not yet dead, and that, as long as one man carried. The sheriff of this forgotten town was not the iron-jawed hero sung about in dime novels, but a weary figure half hidden beneath the brim of a sun-stained hat, his badge no brighter than the tarnished brass buckle on his belt. And though he wore it each day pinned against his vest, he carried it less as a symbol of power and more as a reminder of duty that pressed upon him like the desert heat, heavy, relentless, and always present. For he had not come west seeking glory or law. He had come west chasing silence, a chance to outpace debts and memories from another life. But the silence of the desert had turned into responsibility when no one else dared to shoulder it. And so he became sheriff in name, if not in strength, a reluctant guardian of a place that mocked the very idea of order. His office was a leaning shack near the livery, its window rattling in every gust of wind, its desk covered not with neat reports, but with scraps of paper scrawled in uneven ink, each note a record of thefts unanswered, robberies unpunished, murders unsolved, a ledger of defeat that he sometimes stared at until the words blurred and the weight of failure pressed against his chest, so hard he thought his ribs might crack. And yet each morning he pinned the badge to his vest again, stepped into the light of a sun that burned without mercy, and walked the dust-choked street with a rifle across his back. Because the people, poor and stubborn, still needed to see someone carrying the burden, even if that burden was too great for any one man. The jailhouse attached to his office was little more than two rusted cages, one door jammed so badly it would never shut, the other lined with bars so warped a determined drunk could slip through. And more than once he had dragged men into those cells only to wake before dawn and find them gone, slipped away into the desert or freed by friends with quicker guns. And so he stopped expecting cells to hold anyone for long, relying instead on words, warnings, and the thin thread of his presence to keep the peace. Though he knew peace in this town was nothing but a pause between storms. In the saloon, when the lamps burned low, he sometimes sat with his hat pulled over his brow, sipping whiskey slowly, not for pleasure, but for the fire it gave him in his chest, a fire he needed to face the endless night patrols, the endless waiting for the inevitable sound of boots rushing down the street. For he understood that his enemies were not only the gangs who robbed stagecoaches or the rustlers who stripped ranches bare. His enemies were also hunger, thirst, greed, loneliness, each of them gnawing at the people until desperation made outlaws of men who had once been farmers, blacksmiths, fathers, and though he sometimes dreamed of leaving selling his horse, abandoning the badge, vanishing into the horizon, he remained, because departure would mean surrendering the town to the wolves circling it. Wolves, both human and wild, and he could not let himself be remembered as the sheriff who fled. Children followed him with wide eyes as he walked, not because they admired him, but because they sensed in him a fragile line between safety and chaos. And mothers nodded politely when he passed, though behind their nods was doubt, for they knew his badge could not stop a bullet, could not return a stolen son, could not bring justice to graves marked only by crooked stones on the hill beyond town. Yet still they wanted him there, because an imperfect guardian was better than no guardian at all. At night, lying on the narrow cot in his office, he often kept one hand resting near the revolver on the table, his ears straining to separate the sigh of the wind from the sound of a boot scraping the street, his mind replaying every threat he had heard, every name muttered in anger, every promise of vengeance that lingered in the smoke-filled saloon. And he wondered how many nights he had left before one of those promises found him in the dark. And yet, when the rooster cried at dawn and the desert flared gold again, he rose, washed his face in the cracked basin, and stepped back into the dust with his rifle. Because survival in the West was not about triumph, but about endurance, about rising each day even when the land itself seemed determined to bury you. And in that stubborn rising, in the slow, steady rhythm of his boots against the boardwalk, there was a strange poetry, a defiance that whispered to the town that law, however fragile, was not yet dead, and that as long as one man carried its burden, hope, however faint, still flickered like a lamp struggling against the desert wind. Night in the Wild West did not arrive the way it did in gentle lands, where twilight lingered like a soft curtain. It came suddenly, the last sliver of sun swallowed behind jagged hills, and the world fell into shadow, so complete it felt as though the desert itself had been waiting all day to reclaim its dominion. And in that instant the heat fled, leaving behind a bitter cold that seeped into every board, every stone, every bone of the weary town, so that lamps were lit not only for light, but for warmth, their trembling flames casting narrow halos that barely reached beyond their windows, while the rest of the world drowned in darkness so thick it pressed against the glass like a living thing. And if you walked the street then, slow and careful, the crunch of your boots echoing unnaturally loud, you would understand why so many men who strutted proudly under the sun now sat trembling behind bolted doors. Because the night here belonged not to people but to whispers, to unseen movements, to the eerie sense that countless eyes were fixed upon you from the alleys, the rooftops, the endless desert beyond. The sheriff, pacing with rifle across his back, knew well that night was the outlaw's companion. For crimes here did not flourish in daylight, but in shadow, when vengeance could slip like smoke through a window, when a debt unpaid could be settled with a quiet blade instead of a noisy duel. And he would pause sometimes under the flickering glow of the lanterns strung across the saloon, scanning the dark where the road disappeared, straining to catch the shape of a rider, or the glint of steel, or the faint glow of a campfire on the horizon. Yet the desert kept its secrets close, offering only silence, a silence so oppressive it made the breath catch in your throat. Inside the homes of the town, people whispered to whispers thick with fear and speculation. A mother telling her husband she had seen a stranger watching the well too long. A ranch hand confessing that tracks near the corral had not belonged to any horse he knew. Gamblers trading rumors that a gang had been spotted at the riverbend, their horses restless and their faces shadowed. And though such whispers seemed fragile, almost foolish, they spread like wildfire, growing with each telling until the very air felt swollen with expectation. And those who lay awake at night could almost hear them riding on the wind, thin voices circling the town as if carried by ghosts, farther beyond the reach of lamplight, out past the crooked fence posts and the abandoned wagon wheels sinking into sand. The desert was alive with quieter sounds, the restless scurry of jackrabbits, the mournful call of owls, the distant yip of coyotes whose cries were so hauntingly human that some swore they were not animals at all, but the voices of the dead, souls of men left unburied on the trail, condemned to wander until debts of blood were repaid. And whether you believed the stories or not, their howls could raise the hair along your arms, for they rose in chorus, swelling and falling with the moonlight until it felt as though the night itself was breathing around you. In one lonely house at the edge of town, a farmer sat polishing his revolver with trembling hands, not out of vanity, but because he knew that the man he had cheated at cards a week ago had sworn revenge. And in another cabin, a widow stared at a candle burning low, whispering the names of her dead into the flame, believing that curses carried weight. And perhaps she was right, for here words could kill as surely as bullets. In the saloon, though the piano had long since fallen silent, a handful of men still lingered, their voices low, their dice rattling on the table like bones, each of them pretending calm, yet never letting their hands stray far from pistols. For they too knew that the night was a time when grudges ripened, when tempers flared without warning, and when the sharp crack of a gunshot could split the silence so suddenly that even the coyotes would fall quiet, and the sheriff, listening from his lonely patrol, would freeze for a heartbeat, his heart pounding, knowing that sound would lead him to another body sprawled in the dust, another name whispered into fearful mouths, another mark upon the endless list of failures that he alone carried. But on some nights, no shots rang out, no windows shattered, no doors splintered beneath fists. And it was in those nights that the silence grew heavier than violence itself, pressing into every corner of the town until sleep felt impossible. Because silence here was never trust, never peace. It was a pause, a waiting, a gathering of shadows before the storm. And the longer it stretched, the more certain everyone became that something terrible was coming, riding with the dawn or slipping in with the fog before sunrise. And perhaps that was why even the bravest men who survived by the gun would sometimes sit shivering by their lamps until dawn, unable to sleep, whispering prayers they did not believe, because they knew, as all in the West eventually learned, that the night did not belong to them. It belonged to the desert, to the whispers, to the crimes unfolding just beyond their sight. And in that knowledge lay the true burden of survival, not the hunger, not the thirst, not even the violence, but the endless weight of waiting for what the darkness was hiding. Dawn in the Wild West was never the gentle kind sung about in poems. It was not rosy-fingered or soft as silk, but instead reluctant bleeding of gray light that crept across the hard desert floor like smoke escaping a dying fire. And when that first pale glow broke the horizon, the town stirred not with joy but with suspicion, because dawn in this country did not promise a clean slate. It only revealed what the night had left behind, and the sheriff, weary-eyed and stiff from another night of half-sleep on his narrow cot, rose at that same moment each morning with the quiet knowledge that sunlight brought no safety, only exposure, for in the thin clarity of morning every broken fence, every missing horse, every bloodstain in the dust became visible. And it was his task to read those signs like grim scripture, to piece together the story of crimes committed under the cover of darkness. He stepped into the street with the rifle slung across his back, boots crunching against frost that had formed overnight on the dust, breath clouding before him in the cold air. And though the sky blushed faintly pink in the east, there was nothing romantic in it, only a dull announcement that the cycle of hardship had begun again. For dawn here meant work. Dawn meant accounting. Dawn meant facing the small wreckage left behind by desperate men in desperate land. And already he could hear it, the squeak of hinges as doors creaked open, the shuffle of tired feet, the coughs of men who had spent the night drinking, the soft cries of children roused too early, all of it blending with the dry sigh of the desert wind, as if the land itself were waking reluctantly. Mothers carried pails toward the well, glancing over their shoulders with guarded eyes. Fathers led mules to fields that had more stones than crops, and ranch hands stumbled toward corrals where missing hoofprints told of cattle stolen in the night, while from the saloon, its shutters banging softly, the keeper swept shards of glass from last night's brawl into a pile that glittered like a cruel reminder of how fragile peace always was. And as the sheriff passed, men nodded in silence, not with respect but with expectation, for each of them carried questions behind their tired stares. What will you do about the theft? What will you do about the rider spotted on the ridge? What will you do about the smoke someone saw at the canyon end, though they never asked aloud? The weight of those unspoken demands pressed heavier than any outlaw's pistol, and he bore it like he bore his badge, quietly, stubbornly, because no one else would. He stopped at the edge of town then, staring out toward the horizon where faint tracks cut across the dust, lines drawn by horses that had ridden hard under moonlight, and he crouched low, tracing his fingers along the indentations, reading them as though they were words in a book, noting how deep they pressed, how wide the stride stretched, how sharply they veered toward the river, and he could almost see the riders, shadows hunched low in their saddles, guns heavy at their sides, their laughter carried away by the desert wind. And though he had no proof, only tracks and whispers. He knew their work would soon become his burden. Another unsolved crime added to the ledger on his desk. Another ghost haunting his thoughts when he lay down to restless sleep. Back in town, the preacher stood before the chapel, broom in hand, sweeping dust from the steps, though the desert would scatter more by noon. His movements slow, mechanical, an act of ritual more than hope. And across from him, the blacksmith hammered at a horseshoe, each strike echoing down the street like a heartbeat, steady, weary, unending, while children chased each other barefoot, their laughter thin and fleeting like birds startled into the air. And all of it, the hammering, the sweeping, the laughter, the whispers wove together into the rhythm of survival. A rhythm that did not change, no matter how many men were buried on the hill, no matter how many cattle vanished in the night, no matter how many bullets cracked the silence. For life here was endurance, nothing more, nothing less. And in that endurance, the sheriff found his own reflection, because though his body ached, though his eyes burned with sleeplessness, though his soul whispered for escape, he endured too, lifting his rifle higher on his shoulder, setting his jaw, walking once more the length of the dusty street, as though the mere act of rising, of being visible, of refusing to surrender, was itself the thin barrier holding back the flood of chaos that forever lapped at the edges of this fragile settlement. He thought then, as he often did at dawn, of the stories told back east, stories of lawmen carved from iron, men who strode into towns with unshakable will and bent the world to order with the force of their presence. And he almost laughed, bitterly, because the truth was so far removed from myth. He was no hero, no legend. He was a man fraying at the edges, a man fighting sleep and despair as much as he fought bandits. And yet he kept walking, because if he faltered, if he let the burden slip even for a day, the illusion of law would crumble entirely. And perhaps that illusion was the only thing that held the town together. So the dawn rose fully now, the sun climbing with cruel brilliance, burning away the last pale gray and replacing it with the harsh, merciless gold of desert day. And as the sheriff squinted into its glare, heat already rising from the dust, he accepted once again the cold truth that every morning brought, that in this land, survival itself was the victory. That law was a fragile thread spun daily by men too stubborn to quit. And that hope was not born of triumphs, but of endurance, of waking, of standing, of refusing to surrender, even when the desert, the darkness, and the endless grind of crime and loss demanded otherwise. The desert stretched endless and indifferent beneath the rising sun, a vast expanse of sand and stone where silence ruled like a merciless monarch, broken only by the crunch of hooves that cut deep into the dust as riders emerged from the horizon, their silhouettes black against the burning light. 5 men moving as one shadow, horses lathered with sweat, tack jingling in rhythm with each stride, and though from afar they might have seemed like weary travelers chasing water, up close the truth was written in the way they carried themselves, in the way their hats were pulled low to hide their eyes, in the way rifles lay slung carelessly yet ready across their saddles, in the way revolvers hung heavy on their hips, polished from constant use, not for show but for necessity, because these were not wanderers, they were outlaws, the kind the sheriff had feared each night when whispers drifted through town, the kind who came not for peace or trade, but for plunder, for vengeance, for the raw survival that crime alone could purchase in this barren land. And their presence was a storm cloud rolling across a clear sky, subtle at first, easy to mistake for distance, yet inevitable in its arrival. And as they drew closer to the town, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, the wind slowing, the cry of birds falling silent, even the coyotes retreating into gullies, as if nature itself wished no part in what was coming. The leader rode ahead, a man broad-shouldered with a coat too heavy for the heat, its tails whipping with every stride, a scar tracing his jaw like a pale snake. His eyes hidden beneath the shadow of a hat, yet gleaming whenever the sun struck just so, and his reputation preceded him like thunder before rain. 4 stories of his cruelty had drifted through saloons and camps across 3 territories. How he once left a stagecoach driver staked to the sand for the vultures. How he emptied entire wagons of settlers and scattered their belongings across the desert as if mocking their dreams. How his men followed him not out of loyalty but out of fear, because betrayal in his gang was punished with a slow death no one dared to describe. And though many dismissed such tales as those who had crossed paths with him and lived carried eyes hollowed by memory, and they swore every word was true. Behind him rode his men, each hardened by hunger, by violence, by years of scraping life from a land that offered nothing freely won, with a crooked nose set badly after a brawl. One with fingers missing from a botched robbery. One with eyes that never stopped moving as though he expected ambush at every turn. And one so young he might have been mistaken for a farm boy had it not been for the revolver he twirled casually. His grin, wide and cruel, his youth already burned away by the fire of this life. And together they formed a picture of menace that could chill even the bravest lawman. They rode with the ease of men who had spent more of their lives in the saddle than on the ground. Their movements in rhythm, their silence speaking louder than any shouted threat. And with each mile, they closed between themselves and the town. The sheriff's burden grew heavier, though he could not yet see them. For something in the air changed when men like these approached. Dogs barked restlessly, horses stamped nervously in corrals, and townsfolk paused their work, eyes turning toward the horizon as if they sensed danger without needing to witness it. Whispers starting low and spreading quickly like a fever. Riders are coming, strangers on the ridge, men with guns. And though no one yet knew their names, everyone understood the pattern. For in the West, strangers rarely meant salvation, they meant reckoning. The sheriff, standing at the far end of the street, felt it too. The subtle shift in the morning air, the way light seemed harsher, the way his chest tightened as though some invisible hand pressed against it. And when a ranch hand came running with dust on his clothes and fear in his eyes too, say he had spotted 5 riders heading down from the northern trail, the sheriff only nodded, his jaw tightening, because he did not need to be told what kind of men these were. He had read their arrival in the silence of dawn itself, and he knew with certainty that this was the moment every restless whisper of the past weeks had been leading toward. The moment the town would test its fragile illusion of law against the hard truth of violence. And as he turned toward his office to fetch more ammunition, the sheriff thought not of glory or legend, but only of survival. For in this land, survival was the truest form of victory. And even survival was never guaranteed. The first time the townsfolk truly saw the riders, not as distant shapes on the ridge, but as flesh and blood men drawing closer with every thud of hooves. A silence swept across the street so sudden and complete it seemed the very air had been stolen from their lungs. Shopkeepers halting mid-motion with ledgers open in their hands, blacksmith pausing his hammer mid-swing, mothers pulling children back by their collars into the shadow of doorframe, and even the mangy dogs that roamed the alleys, slinking low with tails pressed to the ground, as though instinct alone told them these men were carved from violence. The 5 outlaws rode in a loose line, dust rising around them like a shroud, and as they reached the edge of town, their leader slowed his horse with a deliberate ease, as if to remind every watching eye that he feared nothing, not the sheriff, not the badges of law, not the weight of God's chapel bells that hung heavy down the street. And his men followed suit, spreading wide so no bullet could take them all at once, their horses stamping impatiently, their revolvers gleaming with an oiled shine that suggested regular, practiced use. And though no words had yet been spoken, the message was clear: the town belonged to them now, or would if they desired it. The sheriff, standing at the far end of the boardwalk near his office, felt the familiar weight of dread settle into his chest. Not the sharp panic of surprise, but the slow, grinding dread of inevitability. Like a man watching storm clouds crawl across the desert sky knowing they cannot be stopped. And though his hand hovered near the revolver on his hip, he did not draw, because, in the West, the first glance, the first move, carried more weight than any bullet. And one rash action could ignite a blaze that would consume every soul within earshot. So instead he met the leader's eyes across the distance, hat brim shadowing his stare, both men studying the other in silence, measuring patience, weighing resolve. The outlaw leader's scar caught the light, his lips curling into the faintest trace of a smile, not of joy but of recognition, as if he had been expecting this meeting all along. As if the sheriff were not an obstacle, but a step in a path already laid before him. And with that smile came a ripple through the crowd, merchants shifting nervously, gamblers whispering behind swinging saloon doors, a boy peeking too far from behind a post before being yanked back by his mother. All of them sensing the same unspoken truth, that something greater than a simple visit had begun, something that would shape the fate of this place in days to come. The sheriff's mind raced, though his face remained carved from stone, and he thought of the town's brittle defenses, 2 rusted jail cells, a scatter of rifles too old for accuracy, a handful of men willing to fight if pushed yet, each with families who would suffer for their bravery. And he weighed those facts against the certainty that the men before him had killed before, had ridden through fire and smoke with laughter on their lips, had survived ambushes and hangings and hunger, and he wondered whether his fragile thread of law could stretch far enough to contain them. The leader raised a hand then, slow and casual, and his horse halted, snorting, pawing at the dirt, while behind him his men spread farther, their eyes scanning windows, rooftops, alleyways, searching for movement, for rifles that might gleam, for any sign of courage foolish enough to oppose them. And their presence filled the air like smoke, choking, heavy, inevitable, so that even the preacher who stood on the chapel steps with broom in hand lowered his gaze and muttered a prayer too soft to be heard. The sheriff's boots creaked against the boardwalk as he stepped forward, just enough to show he would not shrink, his shadow stretching long in the rising sun. And though his voice had not yet risen, though no bullet had yet split the silence, the first glance had already been exchanged. And in that glance, the battle lines were drawn. Invisible yet undeniable, sheriff and outlaw locked in a quiet, simmering standoff that promised the days ahead would not pass in peace but in blood. For in the Wild West, words could delay the inevitable, but eyes, once met, never lied. The sheriff knew that, in this land, words were as dangerous as bullets, sometimes sharper, sometimes heavier, because once spoken they could not be taken back, and they lingered in the dust, in the ears of frightened townsfolk, in the hearts of men too quick to draw steel. So when the outlaw leader finally tilted his head and guided his horse a few steps forward, reins loose in one scarred hand, the sheriff braced himself as though facing down the crack of a rifle, for he understood this moment would define everything that followed. The breathless hush of the crowd, the weight of eyes watching from half-closed shutters, the soft creak of the saloon doors swaying with gamblers peeking out, the muffled cough of a child held too tightly by a mother's hand, all of it folding into the silence that pressed on him like a stone against his chest. The outlaw's voice broke it, deep and lazy, a tone practiced by men who had no need to shout because fear carried their words farther than volume ever could. And he called across the street with a mocking drawl, "Fine little town you've got here, Sheriff. Quiet, the kind that forgets a name soon as it's whispered, the kind we might just take a liking to." And though his lips curved in amusement, his eyes were hard, gleaming with the cruel knowledge that he could make good on the threat behind those words, while his men laughed low in their saddles, the kind of laughter that carried no joy, only hunger. The sheriff stepped down off the boardwalk then, boots sinking slightly in the dust, his hand resting near but not on his revolver, because to touch it too soon would be weakness. And he let his voice carry calm, though it trembled in his gut, saying evenly, "Strangers ride through all the time, but they don't all stop here. Waters down at the well, foods in the saloon, and the road don't end in this town. Words chosen carefully, neither welcome nor threat, a balance that might hold the tension for another day." But the outlaw leader smiled wider, baring teeth, shaking his head as though amused by a child's effort, and he replied, "We're not thirsty, Sheriff, and we've had our fill of road, but what we're looking for is something softer, coin cattle, a place that doesn't bite when you set your teeth in it." And with each word, the crowd seemed to shrink further, shutters slamming shut, whispers rippling like fire, because everyone knew what it meant when men like these spoke in riddles. They were not asking, they were announcing, claiming, daring the law to deny them. The sheriff's jaw tightened, his heart beating against his ribs, and he thought of the rusted cells in his office, of the meager rifles scattered through town, of the preacher with his broom, the blacksmith with his hammer, the mothers with their children, and he realized that whatever words he spoke next would not only be his, they would become the voice of the town. And if he faltered, if he bent too far, the outlaws would own the place before a shot was ever fired. So he straightened his shoulders, letting silence hang heavy before answering. "Law holds here, same as anywhere else, and what's taken without right will be answered for. His words slow, deliberate, each syllable dropped like a stone into still water, rippling outward, and for a moment even the outlaw leader seemed to study him. Eyes narrowed, as if measuring whether the man before him truly believed his own defiance. The seconds stretched long, too long, the kind of silence that makes men twitch, hands itching toward their belts. And the sheriff felt sweat bead under his hat, though the morning was still cool. But he did not look away. He held the outlaw's gaze until the man chuckled, low and dangerous, and spat into the dust, saying, "Law's a fine word for a preacher, Sheriff, but I reckon bullets speak louder, and sooner or later we'll see whose voice carries farther." And with that, he tugged his reins, turning his horse toward the saloon, his men fanning behind him like wolves circling a fire. And as they passed, the sheriff stood rooted in place, the weight of every eye on him, knowing he had not won anything, only delayed the moment when words would give way to lead. But in delay there was still survival, and in survival there was still the faint hope that something, anything, might shift before the storm broke. The batwing doors of the saloon swung open with a groan that seemed louder than a church bell in the tense hush that gripped the town. And into that dim, smoky room rode not one but 5 storms, wearing human faces, boots dragging dust across the warped floorboards, spurs jingling like chains of warning, and the piano man, who had been pounding out a jaunty tune to drown the morning's unease, struck a sour note that trailed off into silence, as though even his fingers feared to continue, while gamblers froze mid-shuffle, cards pressed against sweating palms, and the barmaid with her tray of glasses stood stock-still, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, because she, like everyone else, knew instinctively that the moment belonged not to the law or the town, but to these men who carried the smell of iron and dust and blood with them as naturally as others carried the scent of soap. The outlaw leader strode in first, hat tilted low, eyes cutting sharp beneath its brim, his scar catching the light of the swinging lantern. And without a word, he claimed the center of the room, boots, gaze sweeping over the patrons like a knife across rope, severing courage wherever it was found, while his men fanned out, one leaning against the bar with a grin too wide, another tossing his hat onto a table as though it belonged to him, another kicking a chair backward just to hear it crash, their presence filling every corner, pressing against every chest, until even the smoke from cigars seemed to hang lower in fear. The bartender, a heavy-set man with sleeves rolled to the elbow, swallowed hard and polished the same glass twice, his hands trembling as he muttered, "What'll it be, gents?" in a voice too thin for his broad frame, and the leader let the silence stretch before answering, "Whiskey, all of it, and none of your watered-down tricks." Old man, the words carrying not just command but insult, as though daring the barkeep to deny him. And when the man hurried to obey, the outlaws laughed, the kind of laughter that had no mirth but plenty of menace, their boots stomping in rhythm against the floor, shaking dust from the rafters. A gambler at the far table, nervous and foolish, tried to gather his winnings quietly, thinking no one would notice if he slipped away. But one outlaw's eyes caught the movement, and in an instant the man's hand was pinned to the table by the steel edge of a knife. The gambler's scream muffled as the outlaw leaned close and whispered something no one else could hear, though the meaning was plain enough in the way the gambler nodded, trembling, pressing his lips shut to stifle sobs while blood dripped onto the green felt. And the room collectively understood that silence was survival, that stillness was safety. The leader raised his glass then, whiskey burning down his throat, and with a satisfied sigh he declared, "This town's got a fine feel to it. Boys quiet enough to listen, soft enough to squeeze, just the way I like it." His voice echoing in the rafters like a curse. And no one dared respond, not the dealer clutching his deck, not the girl with her tray, not even the piano man whose fingers hovered helplessly over the keys. Outside, through the open doors, the sheriff stood across the street, watching, listening to the muffled echoes of menace, his jaw clenched, his hand twitching near his holster, though he knew to step inside now would mean slaughter. And so he waited, burning with the helpless fury of a man sworn to protect, yet bound by the fragile thread of strategy, hoping to find the right moment, the right angle, before the town drowned in fear. Back inside, the outlaw leader slammed his glass down so hard it cracked, amber spilling across the wood, and he leaned forward, voice low but cutting through the silence. "Tell your sheriff this is just a drink, nothing more. But next time it might be a fire, or a bullet, or worsened. We'll see how long his law stands when men like us come calling." And though his words were meant for the bartender, they carried across the entire saloon, searing themselves into every ear, branding themselves into the memory of the town. And when the outlaws finally leaned back in their chairs, boots propped on tables, laughter scraping the air once more, the saloon knew it had been conquered, not with bullets, but with presence, not with blood, but with the promise of it. And the people inside would carry that fear like a shadow that stretched far beyond the doors, whispering through every alley and every home, reminding all who heard that the Wild West did not forgive weakness, and that law, no matter how brave, was only as strong as the silence it could endure. That night, the town of Dry Creek lay under a silence so heavy it seemed unnatural, a silence not born of peace but of fear, the kind that makes every creak of timber sound like a gun cocking, the kind that makes even the wind hold its breath. And though the moon rose pale and round above the desert, casting silver light across rooftops and the endless sweep of sand, its glow felt colder than usual, like the watchful eye of something that did not care for the lives of men. Inside the houses, shutters were latched tight, lanterns blown out early, families huddled close on the floors away from windows, whispering prayers that no bootsteps would pause outside their door, no shadows would linger at their threshold, while dogs that usually barked at the night now whimpered and tucked themselves under porches, as if even instinct knew better than to draw attention. Over at the saloon, the outlaws sprawled in crooked chairs, their laughter rising and falling in jagged bursts that echoed into the street, each sound like a nail hammered into the coffin of the town's old peace, their voices slurred with whiskey, yet still sharp with menace. Songs breaking out, then dying in snarls of argument, boots thumping against tabletops, the crash of bottles shattering like gunfire, and the piano man, too terrified to refuse, kept his fingers stumbling across the keys, playing tune after tune with sweat dripping down his brow, knowing that to stop meant risk. Yet to continue meant feeding the chaos that had already swallowed the night. The sheriff, alone in his office across the street, sat at his desk with lamp burning low, the flame guttering with every draft through the cracked window. His revolver laid out before him, cleaned and ready, his badge catching the weak light as he stared at it, weighing the meaning of its shine, wondering if it still carried authority or if it had already been stripped hollow by the outlaw's arrival. And he thought of the townsfolk who looked to him for strength, of the promises he had made to uphold law, to guard the fragile order that gave their lives rhythm. And in that silence, he felt the crushing truth that he was one man, with only a handful of deputies more suited for herding cattle than facing seasoned killers. Yet he also knew that fear left unchecked grew like a wildfire, and if he did not act soon, the town would no longer belong to its people, but to the shadow that had ridden in at dawn. Outside, the street was deserted, dust swirling in the moonlight, every door locked, every lantern dark, save for the saloon, which glowed like a furnace of sin at the town's center. Music and shouts spilling out into the stillness. The outlaw leader sometimes stepping onto the balcony, his silhouette outlined against the glow, smoking a cigar and watching the silent homes as though daring anyone to move, to challenge, to even breathe too loudly, his scar glistening pale beneath the moon. And in that long night, the sheriff rose from his chair and walked the empty boardwalk with boots echoing hollowly, each step sounding louder than the last in the deserted street, until he stopped before the chapel, staring up at the cross that gleamed faintly against the dark sky. And he whispered a prayer, not for his own safety, but for the strength to do what must be done, for the courage to stand even if it meant standing alone, because he knew that when dawn came, the outlaws would not be content with whiskey and cards. They would want more: coin, cattle, flesh, obedience, and, unless someone drew the line, the town's soul would be sold before the sun reached its peak. Back in the saloon, one outlaw flipped a table for sport, sending cards and glasses scattering. Another fired a shot into the ceiling just to hear the scream it drew from the barmaid, and laughter rolled again, jagged and merciless, as if they were wolves feasting in the fold, daring the shepherd to try his luck. And through it all, the outlaw leader remained calm, sipping his drink with that same faint smile that had unsettled the sheriff that morning, a smile that spoke of patience, of inevitability, of a man who believed the world bent to his will. And as the piano stumbled through another trembling tune, the sheriff tightened his jaw, his shadow long in the moonlight, and returned to his office to write a letter. A few words scrawled with steady hand, though his heart pounded words meant for allies beyond the horizon. Words that might bring help, or at least leave behind a record of resistance if he fell. And when he set down his pen, the night stretched on, broken by bursts of laughter, by crashes and curses, until at last the outlaw leader raised his glass in toast to no one in particular and declared the town his for the taking. And though no shot rang out to seal the claim, every man and woman awake in their homes knew it to be true, lying in silence, holding their breath, waiting for dawn when the real battle would begin. The sun crept over the desert horizon with the slow, merciless glow of a forge, its first rays striking the weathered boards of Dry Creek like fire-licking tinder. And though dawn usually carried promise roosters crowing, shopkeepers sweeping porches. The smell of bread drifting from kitchen stoves this morning felt different, heavier, as if the light itself had no courage to chase away the night left behind by the outlaws. And the townsfolk rose not with hope, but with dread, every eye flicking toward the saloon where the batwing doors still swung lazily, where laughter and curses from the long night. Inside, the outlaws sprawled like kings after a feast, bottles overturned, cards scattered across sticky tables, boots kicked high, and in the center, their leader sat upright, not drunk, not weary, but watchful, cigar glowing faintly between scarred fingers, his eyes as sharp at dawn as they had been at dusk. And when his men stirred, groaning, cursing the light, he reminded them with a gravelly chuckle, "This is the kind of town that don't fight back. Boys will take it piece by piece, and by sundown it'll forget it ever had a sheriff." Words that slithered through the haze of smoke and whiskey and burrowed into the bones of the morning. Outside, the sheriff walked the length of the boardwalk with boots striking hollow on the planks, his gaze fixed not on the saloon but on the faces of the townsfolk who peeked from shutters and doorways, eyes wide with silent questions, shoulders hunched under invisible weight. And he knew they expected him to act, to stand, to shield them from the storm crouched in the heart of their town. Yet he also knew that charging in would mean certain death, that his badge alone could not outdraw 5 seasoned killers. And so his mind turned like the gears of a rusted clock, slow but steady, searching for answers, for leverage, for any crack in the wall of menace that the outlaws had built overnight. He paused outside the general store, where old Mrs. Cartwright clutched her broom like a weapon, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Sheriff, they said they'd be back this morning to take what they want." And though he wanted to promise her safety, to say the words that would still her trembling hands, he could not lie. So instead he tipped his hat, voice low but firm, "So long as I stand. This town ain't theirs yet." And though the words felt thin against the weight pressing down, she clung to them as if they were iron, nodding quickly before retreating inside. The sheriff moved on, his shadow stretching long in the rising sun. And as he passed the chapel, the preacher stepped out, face pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, offering not scripture but a rifle, old and worn but steady, saying, "You'll need more than prayers." And the sheriff took it without thanks, for gratitude could wait until the danger passed, if it ever did, and he slung it over his shoulder, adding its weight to the burden already bending his spine. By mid-morning the saloon doors burst open, the outlaws spilling into the street like wolves from a den, swagger in their step, hunger in their eyes, one lighting a cigar, another spitting into the dirt, another firing a shot skyward just to hear it echo. The townsfolk flinching though none dared move. And the leader rode his horse into the street, reins loose, voice carrying, "This town owes us rent for the air it breathes, and we're here to collect." His words falling like a judge's gavel, final and absolute, and his men spread wide, stepping onto porches, yanking open shop doors, demanding coin, supplies, jewelry, whatever caught their eye, while the townsfolk, trembling, handed over what they had, praying it would be enough to keep steel from their throats. The sheriff watched from the far end of the boardwalk, his jaw clenched, his revolver heavy on his hip, but he did not draw, not yet, for he knew that to fire too soon was to die too soon. And instead he memorized their movements, their habits, the way one outlaw favored his left leg, the way another twitched at sudden noise, the way the leader's eyes lingered too long on the bank, already plotting the next theft. And as he studied them, he realized that strategy, not speed, would win this fight, that he must wait for the moment when their arrogance, and until then he would endure the weight of dawn pressing harder on his shoulders than the sun itself. For though law was fragile here, hope was more fragile still, and he could not let it break. The outlaws fanned through Dry Creek like a dust storm made of flesh and steel, their boots pounding across the boardwalks, their laughter carrying the sharpness of knives, and every shop door they kicked open felt like a gunshot to the townsfolk's hearts. The blacksmith's forge falling silent as two of the riders marched in and demanded every horseshoe and hammer, piling tools into saddlebags as though preparing to build an empire of rust, while over at the general store, the bell above the door jingled, not with a customer's welcome, but with menace. The outlaw who entered sweeping jars from the counter with a careless backhand, flour spilling like snow, coffee beans scattering like pebbles, his revolver tapping the wood with each demand until the trembling storekeeper, Mr. Hargrove, handed over every coin from his till, his face gray with shame, his wife clutching their child in the back room, praying the outlaw wouldn't hear the muffled sobs. At the saloon, two others dragged a gambler out by the collar, rifling through his pockets, tossing coins into the dust as though the man's life was worth less than the shine of silver. And their leader remained in the street, mounted high, his eyes sharp as he watched the looting unfold, his voice carrying above the chaos. Take what's owed, and remind the West belongs to those who hold it. Words that cut through the air like branding irons, searing themselves into the memory of every soul watching from behind shutters. And though the people complied, handing over rings, purses, even the locket from an old widow's neck, their eyes turned again and again to the far end of the boardwalk, where the sheriff stood, unmoving, his shadow long in the growing sun, his hand near but not on his revolver, his presence a silent vow that though he could not stop this storm today, he would not bow before it. Inside his chest, his heart hammered, rage burning hotter than the desert. Yet he forced his breath steady, forced his boots to stay planted, because he knew that one bullet now would bring 5 more, and the town would bleed dry before noon. So he studied instead, marking every weakness the outlaw who stuffed more than he could carry, the one whose trigger finger twitched too eagerly, the way their leader's pride stretched his control thin, letting his men scatter too wide, leaving cracks between them. And as the coins clinked into outlaw hands, as supplies vanished from shelves, the sheriff's mind turned to strategy, to the one thing men of violence rarely respected: patience. He slipped into his office under the guise of retreat, but inside he crouched by the iron safe, drawing a map on scrap paper with rough strokes, circling the choke points of the town, the narrow alley between the livery and the smithy, the rooftop of the chapel that overlooked the main street, the wagon path where barrels could be rolled to block and escape it. With each mark, he felt the stirrings of control, fragile but real, a web he could weave slowly until the spiders, who thought themselves hunters, found themselves trapped. he sent his deputy, a wiry young man named Ellis, through the back door with whispered instructions to ride out quiet at dusk, seek allies from the ranchers 3 miles south, and return with men willing to stand before the town was gutted. And though Ellis trembled, though fear shone in his wide eyes, he nodded, because even in fear there was duty, and he slipped away like a shadow. Back in the street, the outlaws tossed a sack of flour into the dirt, laughing as it burst in a white cloud, children crying at the waist while their mothers pulled them back. And the outlaw leader leaned in his saddle, watching the sheriff's office door, waiting for movement, for defiance. And when none came, he smirked, mistaking silence for surrender, his scarred lips curling as he shouted, "Law sleeps when real men ride," drawing cheers from his men. But the sheriff, crouched inside, let the insult pass, because he knew law was not sleeping, it was watching, waiting, sharpening its teeth in silence. And so the looting continued until the outlaws' saddlebags bulged, until the town's streets were littered with broken glass, torn fabric, scattered coins, and silence thicker than the dust. And when at last they regrouped, laughing, swaggering back to the saloon with spoils in hand, the sheriff stepped once more onto the boardwalk, tipping his hat to the townsfolk who watched him with hollow eyes. And though he did not speak, though he did not raise his gun, his presence told them what they needed most, that coins could be stolen, pride could be bruised, but courage, if guarded carefully, could be planted like a seed, waiting for the day it would rise and choke out the weeds. When the sun had climbed past its noontime peak and the air grew heavy with the stillness of exhaustion, Dry Creek appeared on the surface to be nothing more than a broken shell of a town, its once busy street reduced to scattered sacks of grain torn open in the dust, its shop windows cracked, its boardwalks creaking under the hesitant footsteps of those who dared to peek outside. Yet beneath that thin crust of surrender, something restless stirred, a fragile ember of defiance refusing to be snuffed out. And it was this ember that the sheriff tended carefully as he moved through the town, with the unhurried stride of a man who had accepted his place, hat brim pulled low, boots scuffing the planks in deliberate rhythm so as not to draw the sharp eyes of the outlaws lounging outside the saloon, their laughter spilling onto the street like foul water, the sound of coins clinking in their pockets, a cruel reminder of the day's humiliation. Yet the sheriff gave no outward sign of unrest, pausing only now and then as though to rest, speaking only when he leaned close enough for his words to be heard by the right ears. At the blacksmith's forge, where sparks no longer flew because the outlaw raid had stripped the smith of his supplies, the sheriff rested a gloved hand on the cool iron of the anvil, a gesture that seemed casual. Yet his voice, low as a prayer, carried weight when he said, "Iron bends to the right hands." And though the broad-shouldered smith did not lift his eyes from the ground, his thick fingers tightened around the hammer he still held, knuckles whitening as though they, too, understood the meaning buried in the words. And when the sheriff stepped away, the clink of the hammer striking iron rang out once more, sharper, steadier, like the heartbeat of a man who had found a reason to endure. Further along the boardwalk, in front of the bakery, the widow Ellen worked dough with trembling hands, her sleeves dusted white with flour, her face pale from fear and hunger. And as the sheriff leaned at her window, he remarked, idly. Barrels roll easy when pushed together, his tone light, almost conversational, but her eyes flickered with recognition, her movements growing firmer as though the thought of turning flour barrels into barricades gave her arms new strength. And though she said nothing, the crease in her brow softened into something more purposeful. At the chapel, where sunlight streamed through dusty windows and painted golden lines across empty pews, the preacher polished the wood with slow, deliberate strokes, his lips moving in silent prayer. When the sheriff knelt beside him in apparent devotion and whispered, "Bell ropes make strong barriers," and the preacher's hand froze, gripping the cloth tighter before he set his jaw and nodded almost imperceptibly, his voice carrying only the words of his prayer, but his eyes burning now with the certainty of resolve. Children darted through the alleys, their laughter echoing innocently as they chased one another with sticks. Yet within their pockets scraps of paper, rustled notes written in the sheriff's cramped hand, folded tight and delivered house to house, messages hidden beneath the guise of play, their small feet carrying instructions that no outlaw would suspect. For who would suspect laughter of being the mask of rebellion? Even the barmaid from the saloon, a young woman named Clara, who spent her days filling outlaw glasses with whiskey while pretending not to notice their leering stares, was caught on her walk home, where the sheriff paused only long enough to tip his hat and murmur, "Eyes inside are worth more than bullets," before moving on without another word. And though her lips quivered with nerves, she nodded once, clutching her shawl as if it were armor, already replaying in her mind every careless boast and drunken slip she had overheard from the men she served. And so the day wore on, outwardly quiet but inwardly alive with murmurs, each whisper a thread. And by the time the sun leaned westward and the town's shadows stretched long across the dust, those threads had begun to weave themselves into a hidden net, invisible yet tightening with every promise left unspoken, every nod shared between those who only hours ago had cowered in silence. In the sheriff's office that evening, lamplight flickering low, he spread out his crude map upon the desk once more, now marked not just with the alleys and rooftops he had studied before, but with names scribbled in rough strokes: Jonas the smith, Ellen the widow, Reverend Hale, Clara the barmaid, Ellis his deputy, and even the children, whose nimble legs and unnoticed presence would be the veins of his plan. Each name circled, each corner of the town connected by fragile lines that, in his weary eyes, looked less like ink and more like veins of steel, binding the town together in a skeleton of resistance. He crouched there for hours, replaying every word, every nod, imagining how barrels might block wagons, how the bell rope could be tied across the main street to unseat a galloping horse, how iron scraps could be shaped into caltrops that would tear through outlaw boots, how windows could become eyes, and how silence, once a prison, could become their shield. Outside, laughter still spilled from the saloon, the sound of rowdy men drunk on stolen coin, their pride blinding them to the whispers just beyond their reach. And the sheriff knew this blindness was his weapon, the arrogance of wolves who believed the herd too broken to fight. When the lamplight guttered low, he sat back, staring at the revolver on his desk, his hand trembling as it rested on the grip knot from fear alone. Though fear gnawed at him still, but from anticipation, from the knowledge that the weight he carried no longer pressed only on his shoulders, that he was no longer a lone sentinel in the dust, but the quiet leader of a people who had found their courage, not in the thunder of gunfire, but in whispers. And those whispers, though fragile, were already louder than the outlaw's laughter, promising a reckoning that would rise not with shouts, but with the steady resolve of a town that had remembered itself. Night crept over Dry Creek like a blanket woven from shadows and suspicion. And while the saloon roared with the laughter of outlaws drunk on stolen whiskey, their boots stamping out crude rhythms on the warped floorboards, their voices echoing with songs of triumph, the leader of the gang sat apart, his chair tilted back, his whiskey glass half empty, his scarred knuckles tapping the rim as though marking time. But his eyes, sharper than any blade, saw through the fog of revelry, catching the little things that others missed, the fragments of a puzzle that unsettled him. For though his men believed the town broken, he felt in his bones that something beneath the silence had shifted. Clara, the barmaid, moved between tables, her tray balanced steady, her voice calm. Yet he noticed her eyes did not linger on him as they once had when fear ruled her every step. Instead, they flicked toward the door, quick and purposeful, as if she awaited a signal or measured distance to the street. And that flicker unsettled him more than any trembling hand. Jonas the blacksmith had delivered a keg of nails earlier in the evening, and though he kept his head bowed, sweat glistening on his soot-stained brow, the outlaw leader noted how Jonas's eyes traveled not across the men laughing at their own boasts, but upward, toward the rafters, as though judging the strength of beams. And when he set down the keg, his grip lingered on the wood too long, a touch that spoke not of fear, but of calculation. Ellen the widow had entered soon after, carrying a tray of bread loaves she claimed to offer as a peace token, and though she smiled faintly, her smile trembled in a way that felt less like submission and more like defiance, wearing a mask, her hands steady, her gaze refusing to lower even when he met it across the smoky room. And in her quiet strength, he sensed a resistance that no coin could purchase. Then there was the preacher, Reverend Hale, who excused his visit as a call to remind the drunken men of God's day of rest. But his eyes betrayed him. They swept across the room in measured glances, counting bodies, noting exits, observing corners. And the outlaw leader, seasoned by years of ambushes and betrayals, recognized the look of a man who measured ground as if preparing for a battle rather than a sermon. Even the children outside unsettled him, for their laughter carried oddly in the night, light and playful. Yet their quick feet scurried too often toward the sheriff's office or vanished into alleys with the sharpness of errands, not games. And though no outlaw spared them more than a drunken chuckle, the leader's instincts gnawed at him like hunger in an empty gut, whispering that laughter could be a mask just as easily as fear. So he rose at last, pushing back his chair with a scrape that cut through the saloon noise, and strode to the batwing doors, his boots thudding heavy, his coat brushing past Clara as she stiffened at his nearness. And when he stepped outside, the night air pressed cold against his face, the moon sharp as a blade above, silvering the dust that lay thick on the street. And what he saw there made his jaw tighten. Barrels stacked higher than he remembered near the bakery, their placement too neat, too deliberate. Rope coiled in careless abundance near the chapel door, as though waiting to be strung across the street. A wagon left tilted at an angle that blocked half the alley by the smithy, its wheels locked by a stone that looked too deliberate to be chance. And though to any drunk these things would seem harmless, to him they screamed preparation, screamed whispers, screamed hands working quietly to shape defenses under the veil of surrender. He scanned further, catching the faint glow of lamplight in the sheriff's office. And in that flicker, he thought he saw a shadow move across the window, a brief silhouette bent over something, perhaps a map, perhaps nothing, but in his chest the weight of suspicion grew heavier, reminding him of ambushes past in the canyons where a silent ridgeline had hidden rifles waiting to tear men apart, of border towns where villagers bowed by day but struck with knives by night, of every moment where arrogance had blinded men into graves. And though he had always prided himself on seeing further than others, on knowing when the wind shifted, he now felt that same restless unease settling on Dry Creek, a town he had written off as broken, but which now breathed differently, like prey that had remembered its teeth. Anger rose in him, burning hot, for pride was the only armor he wore, and doubt was the only crack that could pierce it. So he stormed back inside, the saloon doors flapping like wounded wings behind him, and slammed his boot against the warped floor, silencing laughter in an instant. The coins tossed in the air, falling with harsh clinks as his men turned to him with bleary eyes, and he growled, his voice like thunder, "This town looks too still for my liking. Double the watch. Keep your eyes sharp, and if anyone so much as whispers, 'I want it,' dragged into the street," his command rolling heavy through the smoky air, sobering some, irritating others, but all obeying, stumbling to their feet, strapping revolvers, pushing past one another as they spilled into the night, taking posts on rooftops, leaning against alleys, their arrogance now tempered by the edge in his tone. Yet even as they obeyed, even as he settled once more at his corner table with the whiskey glass untouched before him, he could not shake the image of the barrels stacked like barricades, the ropes like snares, the wagon angled like a wall, nor the flicker of the sheriff's shadow across the lamplight. And when he closed his eyes, he saw not the broken faces of defeated townsfolk, but the quiet, steady eyes of people who had chosen patience over fear. And it struck him harder than any bullet that perhaps, for the first time in years, the hunter was not as free as he believed, but already standing in a trap he could not see. The night deepened until the desert sky stretched black and endless above Dry Creek, stars burning like scattered embers in the void. And though the town seemed silent, each corner breathed tension so thick it felt alive, every shuttered window hiding wide eyes, every creak of timber echoing louder than gunfire, for the townsfolk, roused by whispers and bound now by secret purpose, lay awake in their beds, listening for the sound of boots on dust, while outside the outlaws prowled their new watchposts, cursing under their breath, their drunken swagger tempered into irritation by the orders of their leader, who sat alone at his table in the saloon, staring at the untouched whiskey before him, his scarred jaw clenched as the weight of unseen resistance pressed against him like a storm he could not name. And across the street, in the dim glow of his office lamp, the sheriff crouched low over his desk, his rough map spread beneath his hands. his revolver oiled and loaded but untouched at his side. For his weapon tonight was not steel but patience, a tool he had cultivated through years of watching men die for haste. He moved pins and coins across the crude sketch of the town, whispering names under his breath like prayers: Jonas, Ellen, Hale, Clara, Elisande. At intervals, he paused, listening. For even through the thick walls, he could hear faint sounds of boots shifting outside, outlaw whistles sharp in the cold air. Yet with each sound, his resolve only deepened, for fear had lost its hold, replaced now by a clear-eyed focus that made him feel almost detached, like a hunter studying prey. And so he extinguished the lamp and sat in the darkness, waiting. Across the street, Clara moved among the outlaws in the saloon, filling glasses with trembling grace, but her ears strained for their talk. And when one muttered about the barrels by the bakery, wondering aloud if they hadn't been stacked too neatly, she laughed lightly, distracting him. Yet later, when she slipped through the back door into the night air, she carried the memory of his suspicion to the sheriff's office, tapping once on the door before vanishing back into the shadows like a ghost, leaving behind only the trace of her whispered warning. And the sheriff, hearing it, knew his enemy's nerves were fraying. Meanwhile, Jonas, under the guise of working late at his forge, hammered softly, each strike muffled, shaping scraps of iron into small, cruel triangles meant to shred boot leather or horseflesh, his sweat dripping not from heat but from urgency. While Ellen kneaded bread in her kitchen, her barrel lids shifted subtly each time she passed, as though testing how easily they would roll when pushed into the street, her lips murmuring steady hymns that drowned the sound of her heartbeat. Reverend Hale stood alone in the chapel tower, bell rope in hand, gazing out over the rooftops like a sentinel, his prayers drifting into the cold air as if to bless the battle yet to come. And down the dirt road, Ellis the deputy rode, quietly under the moon, his horse's hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, carrying word to the ranchers south of town, each mile stretching heavy but vital, his young heart pounding with the terror and pride of a man stepping beyond boyhood into history. All these threads wove tighter through the hours, and though no bullet had yet been fired, Dry Creek was already alive with a war fought in silence. Every glance a message, every shift of a barrel a maneuver, every whispered prayer a battle cry. And it was in this silence that the outlaw leader felt his unease swell until it tasted bitter on his tongue. For he could not shake the image of the sheriff's shadow against the lamplight earlier, nor the stillness of a town that seemed too deliberate, too patient. So near midnight he rose, barking at two of his men to follow him, and strode into the street, his spurs biting sharp into the dust, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the dark alleys and shuttered windows. And when he stopped before the sheriff's office, silence pressed around him like a living thing. He raised a fist, ready to pound the door open, when from the shadows at the edge of the boardwalk, a voice spoke low, steady, and near enough to cut through the night air, looking for something you already lost. And though the outlaw leader turned quick, hand dropping to his revolver, he found only the sheriff standing half in shadow, arms crossed, his stance unflinching, his hat brim casting his eyes into darkness. And in that moment, though no guns were drawn, the air snapped taut as a bowstring, the men behind the leader shifting uneasy. the silence of the street stretching into eternity. The sheriff's words hung heavier than lead, not a threat but a declaration, a promise that resistance had already taken root. And though the outlaw leader scoffed, spitting into the dust, muttering something about dead men's courage, he felt the crack widen in his certainty. For the lawman's stillness carried a weight stronger than whiskey or bullets. The weight of a man not alone, a man with whispers behind him. And when the leader finally turned away, his boots dragging heavier than before, the sheriff let him go, knowing the first spark had been lit, that the war for Dry Creek had begun not with gunfire, but with silence broken by words too sharp to ignore. And though the town still slept in fragile fear, its people would remember this night as the one where the hunter first realized the prey had teeth. Morning in Dry Creek arrived without the usual calm, though the sun rose just as it always had, a pale disk climbing slowly over the jagged horizon, bleeding gold into the desert sky, painting the cracked boards of storefronts with warmth. Yet beneath the light, the town moved differently, as though every shadow carried purpose, every motion concealed intent. And though to a passing traveler it might have looked like any ordinary morning, women sweeping porches, children skipping along the dusty street, men leading mules to the trough, air itself was thick with something unspoken, the breath of people preparing for a day they all understood might be their last. And at the heart of it, the sheriff stood outside his office, his hat brim low, his eyes scanning the rooftops and alleys, not as a man surveying peace, but as a general studying a battlefield. Jonas hammered early at the forge, each strike sending sparks into the pale light. But beneath his apron, he hid the fresh caltrops he had forged through the night, wrapping them in cloth and passing them off to Clara, who carried them in her serving basket beneath loaves of bread, her gait steady, her face calm, her eyes fixed only forward. Yet every step brought weapons into the hands of townsfolk who would scatter them across the alleys when darkness fell again. Ellen moved about the bakery, sliding bread into the oven as she always did, though each barrel by her wall had been filled with stones and sand to weigh them down, their lids sealed with just enough slack to roll free. And when she brushed flour from her hands, it dusted the edges of crates that were less about food now and more about cover. The bakery no longer a place of nourishment, but a fortress hidden in plain sight. Reverend Hale knelt at the chapel altar, his lips moving in prayer. Yet his mind counted the seconds it would take to pull the bell rope and ring the alarm. His faith tonight, as much in the courage of the townsfolk as in the God he served. And from the rafters above, a boy of no more than 12, crouched with sharp eyes, sent there by Jonas to watch the street from the highest point, his young heart hammering with the knowledge that his role, though small, might save lives. Ellis had not yet returned from the ranches, but word filtered quietly that riders were on the move. Ranchers gathering rifles and horses, men hardened by the desert's cruelty, men who owed little to law but much to pride, their loyalty not to the sheriff himself but to the land that the outlaws had desecrated. And though distance and time still kept them away, their presence loomed like a promise waiting to arrive. Meanwhile, in the saloon, the outlaw leader stirred from restless sleep, his head pounding from whiskey, but his mind sharper than the steel at his belt. For the encounter with the sheriff in the night echoed still, not in words alone, but in the weight behind them, the unflinching silence of a man who had dared meet him without fear. And when he rose, pulling on his coat, he found his men not with the same ease as before, but in small clusters, murmuring low, some casting glances toward the street, others pretending at laughter that rang hollow. And he knew, without asking, that doubt had crept among them like rot in timber. One man swore he had seen shadows moving near the smithy long after midnight. Another claimed the barrels by the bakery shifted places while they drank, and though their leader barked at them, calling them cowards drunk on ghosts, their unease gnawed at him. For his own eyes had seen the same details, and his instincts whispered the same warnings. He stepped outside into the brightening day, his boots crunching on the dust that glowed gold in the morning sun, and he saw the sheriff across the street, speaking with Ellen as she dusted her flour-covered hands. Their words too low to carry, their stances too casual. And yet the sight struck him as wrong, for no widow should look so steady when surrounded by killers. No lawman should stand so openly when outnumbered. And it burned him with anger that steadiness itself could feel like defiance. He strode down the street, his men trailing reluctantly, their spurs jangling, and the townsfolk paused in their chores, sweeping halted, water buckets set down. Laughter cut short, but none ran, none lowered their eyes as they once had. And though silence followed the outlaw leader's march, it was not the silence of fear, but of endurance. Like the desert itself, waiting for the storm, he stopped before the sheriff, spitting into the dust, sneering something about weak men hiding behind women and bread. But the sheriff only tilted his head slightly, answering not with bluster, but with quiet steel. Bread feeds men, but courage keeps them standing. Words simple, yet spoken so evenly they cut deeper than insults. And behind him, Ellen's hand brushed a barrel as though to steady herself, though both men knew it was a gesture that meant far more, a signal wrapped in subtlety, and for a heartbeat the street hung in tension, outlaws shifting their weight, hands hovering near pistols, townsfolk frozen mid, children watching from windows, the desert wind carrying only the dry rattle of brush. And then the leader laughed harshly, turning away, muttering to his men that the lawman was a fool playing at war. But even as he walked, dust swirling at his heels, the unease in his chest refused to quiet. For in that moment he realized Dry Creek had ceased being Prayet, had become a fuse, and his presence the spark, and whether he wished it or not, the town was ready to burn. By noon, the desert sun bore down on Dry Creek with merciless heat, baking the street into a pale river of dust, its glare bouncing off windows until even shadows seemed to squint. And though the outward life of the town carried on with a semblance of routine, every moment was thick with tension, like a rope stretched too tight, ready to snap at the slightest pull. Inside the saloon, the outlaw leader paced with restless energy, his boots striking the warped floorboards in uneven rhythm, his eyes sharp and predatory, yet haunted by something he refused to name. And though his men lounged at tables, cards spread, whiskey poured, their laughter rang hollow, brittle as glass. Each hand played slower, each sip dragged longer, for doubt had crawled into their bones, and in whispers they questioned the wisdom of staying in a town that no longer bowed its head. Some muttering that the sheriff's eyes carried a weight stronger than their pistols, others recalling the barrels, the ropes, the subtle movements of townsfolk that no longer felt random. And though no one spoke openly against their leader, the murmurs alone festered, a sickness of fear dressed as suspicion, while he, sensing it, grew harsher, barking orders, slamming fists on tables, threatening to string up the next man who spoke of ghosts in daylight. Yet his fury was less command than desperation, for he knew control, once cracked, never mended clean. Meanwhile, beyond the saloon doors, the town worked in silence that disguised itself as routine. Jonas hammering metal at his forge louder than ever, masking the thuds of iron spikes hidden in barrels. Ellen carrying baskets of bread to neighbors, yet slipping wrapped bundles beneath cloth. Clara smiling at outlaws while her eyes scanned every corner, memorizing their patrols. Reverend Hale ringing the chapel bell once at midday, not for prayer, but as a test, its low toll answered by shutters creaking open in quiet unison, a signal disguised as habit, and each small act stitched tighter the web of defiance that bound the people together, unseen yet undeniable. In the sheriff's office, maps covered his desk, crude lines marking alleys, notes scrawled in the margins, naming each townsfolk's role. And though his deputy, Ellis, had not yet returned, he placed faith in the boy's ride, trusting that ranchers would come when the time called, though whether they came in time or not was a question that gnawed at him. For every hour that passed was another hour the outlaws had to discover what simmered beneath their feet. He stood often at the window, arms crossed, hat low, watching the saloon, feeling the weight of eyes on him in return. The invisible duel with the outlaw leader stretching across the street like a drawn wire, silent, taut, daring one side to snap first. Inside, the leader sent 2 scouts riding out, their horses kicking up dust as they vanished into the desert, his mind restless with visions of ambushes and reinforcements. And when whispers reached him that Jonas had been seen moving heavy barrels late into the night, he slammed the informant against the wall, snarling that a blacksmith's work was no threat to guns. Yet when he released him, his own hands trembled faintly, for the unease would not leave, and even his men noticed, trading glances that no longer carried loyalty but quiet judgment. In the corners of the saloon, younger outlaws grew restless, asking why they still lingered in a town that no longer gave them gold, or women, or fear. And though the leader silenced them with glares, he knew their hunger for movement could soon turn against him. For men without fear were dangerous, but men with doubt were worse. They spread rot from within, silent and slow, until nothing remained but collapse. Outside, as afternoon stretched long and shadows sharpened, children played with sticks in the dirt, their laughter carrying across the street. Yet their patterns were no longer random games, but coded paths, weaving from one house to another, carrying slips of cloth, fragments of food, whispered messages, each childish run-a-stitch in the tapestry of revolt. And though a few outlaws chuckled at their antics, the leader's eyes narrowed, seeing something too deliberate. And when he muttered that even children could be knives, his men shifted uneasily, their leader's paranoia no longer sounding like wisdom but madness. And still, though doubt ate at him. Though his instincts screamed, he could not move openly. For to lash out without cause would expose weakness, and so he bottled his fury, swallowing it like poison, even as it burned his gut. While across the street, the sheriff sharpened his resolve, reminding himself that war was not won in sudden thunder, but in the slow erosion of certainty. And as the sun dipped lower, turning the desert sky into a wash of blood and fire, Dry Creek seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the knife's edge of two fates, the town's heart beating louder than the silence that stretched between outlaw and lawman, between predator and prey, until even the wind itself seemed to wait for the first stone to break. Night fell heavy over Dry Creek once more, the sky a curtain of black stitched with faint stars, the moon thin and sharp as a blade, its pale light washing the dirt street into silver lines. And though the saloon still glowed with lamplight and laughter forced from uneasy throats, the true heart of the town beat in silence, beneath shutters, behind doors, in whispered prayers and steady hands, preparing for the strike they knew must come. In the blacksmith's shop, Jonas stood at the forge's dying embers, sweat streaking down his soot-darkened face, his strong hands guiding caltrops into burlap sacks, each iron piece small yet cruel, their points catching what little light flickered. And beside him, Ellen worked with a calm that belied her widow's grief, rolling barrels toward the door one by one, their weight disguised as flour, but filled instead with sand and stone, each ready to topple and block a path, her movements sure, her breath steady, as if kneading dough for bread instead of shaping walls for war. Clara slipped through back alleys, her serving tray abandoned, her skirt hiked just enough to run without sound. And in her hands she carried the cloth-wrapped spikes Jonas had given her, placing them gently at crossroads and shadows where outlaw boots would tread, her heart pounding but her face serene, for fear had long since burned into something colder, a resolve sharpened by nights of humiliation and mornings of dread. And as she worked, she passed wordless nods to other women leaning in doorways, men smoking quietly in the dark, children crouched by fences, each ready with their small tasks, each part of the machine that had become Dry Creek's hidden resistance. In the chapel tower, Reverend Hale gripped the bell rope, his eyes scanning the rooftops, his voice a low murmur of scripture, though his mind counted heartbeats, rehearsing the moment he would pull with all his weight to unleash the alarm that would ring across the desert, a cry not of prayer but of defiance. Meanwhile, the sheriff crouched in his office, lantern dimmed to a faint glow, rifle across his lap but untouched, his true weapon, his patience, his ears tuned to every creak, every shifting footstep outside, for he knew the night would test them all. And across the street, the outlaw leader sat in the saloon's shadowy corner, his glass of whiskey untouched, his men sprawled in uneasy silence, no longer drunk but restless, their nerves stretched thin by the stillness of a town that should have been broken, but instead seemed to breathe stronger with each passing day. And though some muttered to each other that they had seen shadows flitting along the alleys, the leader silenced them with a glare. Though he himself had noticed the same shapes, felt the same unease gnawing at him, and when he finally barked orders for a few to patrol the street, they obeyed sluggishly, stepping out into the cool night air, their boots crunching dust, their spurs rattling faint, their laughter forced, carrying rifles, but carrying also the weight of doubt. They did not notice at first when one stumbled, cursing softly, his boot punctured by something sharp, and though he limped and spat, calling it nothing more than a nail, another soon followed, his horse snorting as it stepped on something jagged, stumbling into the dust, and when they bent low to see, the moonlight revealed the cruel angles of iron teeth scattered where no blacksmith had reason to spill them. And a chill crawled into their bones, for they knew such things were not accidents. Further down the street, another pair turned a corner and found their path blocked by barrels, heavy and stacked, and when one shoved against them, they did not budge, waited too deliberately, their placement too perfect, and in the silence of the night, the smallest sound carried the scuff of feet above them on a rooftop, the whisper of a window shutter closing, the faint creak of wood bending beneath hidden weight-tand. Suddenly, every shadow seemed alive, every corner a threat, and panic clawed at their throats, though no bullet had yet been fired. Word carried quick back to the saloon, men stumbling inside with curses, speaking of iron scattered in the dust, of barrels heavy as stone, of eyes watching from the dark. And the outlaw leader's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the edge of the table until wood splintered beneath his fingers. For he had expected fear to rule this place. Yet instead, the town itself now moved like an enemy, every barrel a barricade, every spike a weapon, every silence a scream. He stormed into the street with fury, his men trailing behind, their rifles raised though aimed at nothing. And as he stood in the center of town, his breath steaming in the cold, he roared into the night for the sheriff to show himself, his voice echoing against the clapboard walls. But only silence answered, silence heavier than any bullet, silence that pressed into his ears until he could hear his own heart thundering. And though the sheriff remained hidden, watching from a darkened doorway, his absence spoke louder than presence, for it told the outlaw leader that the lawman was not afraid, that he controlled the game, that he would choose the time of reckoning. And for the first time in years, the leader felt something slip inside him, not strength, not rage, but doubt, sharp and cold, a doubt his men saw in the tension of his stance, in the tremor of his jaw. And though they still followed him, their faith no longer clung as tightly, and the cracks widened with every heartbeat. In that moment, as the moonlight carved sharp shadows across the dirt street, Dry Creek shifted fully, no longer prey hiding in corners, but a predator waiting in silence. Its people armed not with guns, but with patience, with unity, with the courage to weave fear into the hearts of their oppressors. And though no gunfire lit the night, though no blood stained the dust, this was the first true victory of the town, the first trap sprung, the first proof that they could bend the hunters into feeling hunted. And when the outlaw leader finally turned back toward the saloon, his boots grinding against the scattered iron points in the dust, the town itself seemed to watch him. Every window a pair of eyes, every shutter a silent witness. And though he spat into the dirt as if to claim defiance, the taste in his mouth was not rage but ash, for he knew now that Dry Creek would not break, would fight. The night stretched long after the first traps were discovered, and though no blood had spilled, the air in Dry Creek felt heavier than gunpowder, charged with a silence that cut deeper than any gunshot. a silence that pressed hardest inside the saloon where the outlaw leader gathered his men. The lamplight casting harsh shadows across faces lined with fatigue and unease. Cards lying forgotten on the table, whiskey glasses untouched. For laughter had died and swagger had withered, replaced by darting eyes and muttered suspicions that clung like smoke. Some cursed the townsfolk openly, spitting that farmers and widows had no right to stand against men with guns. Others whispered that the sheriff's quiet was not courage, but trickery, that maybe he had riders hidden beyond the ridges, ready to storm down, and though none spoke the words aloud, each man wondered in the hollow of his chest whether they had overstayed in Dry Creek, whether their leader's pride had tethered them to a trap tightening around their throats. The leader himself sat in the corner, his scarred hands gripping the arms of his chair as if to crush wood into dust, his eyes burning with the fury of a man who had spent years bending others with fear, now confronted by the unthinkably town that had refused to break and, though his lips curled with sneers and threats, his heart thudded with a rhythm he had not felt since his earliest days in the desert, when ambushes had claimed half his gang in canyon passes, when silence itself had spelled death, and that memory gnawed at him now, whispering that Dry Creek's stillness was not weakness but design. He barked orders suddenly, slamming his fist against the table, demanding that men patrol in pairs, that windows be smashed to show townsfolk who ruled. But when his men hesitated, trading glances heavy with doubt, his rage swelled into paranoia, seeing betrayal in every flicker of hesitation, every whispered exchange, until he accused one of spying, dragging the man by his collar into the lamplight. Snarling questions no one dared answer, and when the accused stammered denial, the leader's fist struck his jaw with brutal force, the crack echoing through the saloon until the others froze in silence, their fear shifting not toward the sheriff or the town, but toward the man they followed, their leader who now seemed less unshakable and more unhinged, a man unraveling before their eyes. Outside, the sheriff stood by his window, watching the glow of the saloon lamps, hearing faint shouts carry across the street, his jaw tightening as he realized the true battle was already won, in part not through bullets but through doubt, seeded like weeds in the minds of killers, spreading faster than fire across dry brush. And he whispered a prayer not for victory but for endurance, knowing the town had only to hold its nerve for the outlaws to tear themselves apart. Jonas at the forge hammered louder that night, each strike ringing like a drumbeat of defiance, and Ellen stacked more barrels, her movements deliberate, while Clara whispered comfort to children hidden beneath beds, assuring them that silence was their strongest weapon, that fear kept in check would grow into courage. And in the chapel, Reverend Hale prayed louder, his voice echoing in the rafters, words not meant for heaven but for ears listening in the dark, a reminder that they were not alone, that faith bound them tighter than chains. Within the saloon, the leader's fury simmered, his pacing carving grooves into the floorboards, his men silent, cowed, yet simmering with thoughts unspoken, some glaring at him when his back turned, others nursing bruises more from his fists than from battle. And though they still bore guns at their belts, their loyalty had been shot through with cracks that no threats could mend, cracks widening with each hour of silence that the sheriff forced upon them, until the outlaw camp was less a brotherhood and more a tinderbox waiting for the smallest spark of betrayal. The leader drank at last, whiskey spilling down his chin as he cursed the sheriff by name, vowing to drag him into the street at dawn, to burn the town to ash. But even as the words left his mouth, the fire in them rang hollow, for he knew, though he would never admit, that the town's courage had infected even his men, that their silence was a weapon heavier than rifles, that Dry Creek itself had become a noose tightening slowly, and when he staggered into the night, his boots crunching on the dust still littered with caltrops, the sting of iron under his soul was sharper than panic was humiliation, a reminder that even the ground itself had turned against him. And though he spat curses into the wind, the shadows that stretched from shuttered houses seemed to swallow his words whole, leaving only silence behind, silence that promised a reckoning soon to come. The hours bled slow toward dawn, the desert sky paling at its edges, stars fading one by one into the vast, cold emptiness above, and Dry Creek held its breath as if the whole town were a single living thing waiting for the strike of fate. Its shutters closed, its streets empty, its silence louder than any sermon. Inside the saloon, where lamplight guttered low and tempers burned hotter than whiskey, the outlaw leader's paranoia had hardened into a single resolve. He would not allow silence to rule him another moment. He would seize the dawn before it seized him, and so he barked orders through clenched teeth, sending half his men stomping into the street, rifles cocked, spurs jangling against the dust, their boots grinding over iron caltrops that had already drawn blood and curses but were now ignored in their fury, for pride drove them harder than pain. The sheriff watched from the shadows of his office, his rifle resting against the window frame, his eyes calm but sharp, his chest rising steady, though his pulse drummed like war drums. And in his silence, he weighed the moment with the precision of a gambler counting cards, knowing that the first shot would not merely spark a fight, but set fire to everything. And though he wished to hold longer, to let fear gnaw deeper at the outlaw gang, he also knew that sometimes a single bullet could write the story of a town's courage, carving it into history with smoke and flame. Jonas stood outside the blacksmith's, hammer in hand, though his forge was cold, his stance wide, as if rooted to the ground itself. Ellen near him, with her jaw set, her hands clasped around a lantern. She would topple onto barrels if the enemy drew near. Her eyes steady though, her heart trembled in her chest. And Clara crouched at a doorway, her breath slow, her hand resting on the small pistol she had hidden for years in a drawer, its weight strange but steady, as if it had waited for this night to finally see light. While Reverend Hale stood in the chapel tower, his hand gripping the bell rope, sweat beading his brow despite the cold, for he knew that at his pull the whole town would awaken into fire. The outlaw leader stepped into the open, his silhouette a black cutout against the rising pale of dawn, his long coat flaring with each step, his revolver gleaming faint as his hand hovered over its worn grip, his voice a roar across the empty street as he called out the sheriff's name, taunting him, cursing him, daring him to show himself like a man, his words echoing against wood and dust, but only silence answered, a silence so thick it seemed to choke his men where they stood, until one outlaw, jittery with nerves and whiskey both, spat into the dirt and lifted his rifle, swearing he saw a shadow move in the sheriff's window. And in that instant, the tension that had strangled the town for nights finally snapped. The rifle cracked loud. A flash of muzzle fire tearing the gray dawn. The bullet smashing into the sheriff's office wall with a spray of splinters. And though it struck no flesh, its sound was thunder that rolled across Dry Creek, waking children under beds, making women gasp in prayer, making men grip their hammers, pitchforks, or pistols tighter. For the silence was dead, and war had begun. The sheriff did not hesitate. His rifle barked in reply, the shot clean and measured, the bullet slamming into the outlaw's hat and sending it spinning into the dust. A warning more than a kill, yet powerful enough to freeze the gang in their tracks, their bravado curdling into terror as they realized they were not hunters in this town, but prey marked by unseen eyes. The bell in the chapel tower clanged then, Reverend Hell yanking with all his weight, the sound rolling like a holy war cry across the rooftops, and shutters flew open, barrels rolled into place. Figures emerged from shadows, armed with whatever they had, no longer hiding, no longer silent, and the outlaw leader's roar faltered. His men backing toward the saloon, their eyes wide, their unity fraying, while the sheriff lowered his rifle with a grim calm, knowing this was only the beginning, that the first shot was a spark in dry grass, and soon the whole desert would blaze. But for that heartbeat, that single fragile moment before the guns spoke in chorus, the town and the gang stood frozen, the dawn caught in stillness like the breath before a storm, until the outlaw leader's hand twitched toward his revolver, his eyes burning with madness, and the world seemed to narrow to that single motion, that single weapon rising, that single second before the storm broke in full. The first light of dawn crawled across the desert like a reluctant ghost, brushing faint strokes of silver and gold against the ridges beyond Dry Creek. But within the town itself, the morning rose with the violence of thunder. For silence that had held taut for nights finally broke in a crash of gunfire, a rifle cracking loud enough to split the sky, its echo rolling across the street and slamming against wooden walls until children stirred from hidden corners with frightened gasps and women gripped their lanterns tighter, whispering hurried prayers that dissolved into the roar of battle. The outlaw who had fired first staggered in shock when the sheriff's answering bullet ripped his hat from his head, the felt spinning into the dust like a wheel of fate. And though no blood spilled in that instant, the symbolism was a wound deeper than flesh, for it told the gang, in front of all, that their arrogance had been pierced, that the man they mocked as broken stood firm, steady, unyielding, his rifle an extension of his heartbeat, his patience now sharpened into justice. Jonas the blacksmith emerged from his forge, his hammer heavy in one hand, a short-barreled shotgun in the other, his face streaked black with soot that made his eyes burn like embers. And when two outlaws rounded the corner, shouting curses, he answered with steel, not words, swinging the hammer so hard it shattered teeth and bone, the man collapsing with a howl as the second raised his gun to slow, a blast of buckshot tearing the dust from his boots and dropping him shrieking, and the sound carried through the town like a call to arms, awakening courage in men who had hidden too long. Ellen, pale but fierce, toppled one of her carefully stacked barrels into the alley. its weight rolling into the legs of outlaws who stumbled with startled cries, and as they cursed and scrambled to rise, she smashed the lantern she carried, flames licking up in an instant, turning the barrel barricade into a wall of fire that seared the path shut, the orange glow reflecting in her eyes as she shouted for the children to remain hidden and the men to fight, her voice ringing clear as a bell across the chaos. Clara crouched low by the water trough, her skirt damp with morning dew, both hands trembling around the small pistol that had lain untouched in her drawer for years. And when one outlaw sneered and charged toward her, spitting that she had no business holding a gun, she squeezed the trigger with eyes closed, the pistol jerking in her grip as the shot cracked, the man spinning away with a scream, his revolver clattering against the trough. And when she opened her eyes, her breath ragged, she found the courage to lift the gun again, her hands steady now. Her fear melted into fury as she swore she would never serve such men again. From the chapel tower, Reverend Hell yanked the bell rope with all the strength in his wiry arms, the iron tongue hammering against the sides with a booming rhythm that shook the rafters, its echo rolling across rooftops and alleys. And with every toll, the townsfolk grew bolder, shadows stepping into light, armed with rifles long stored, knives sharpened, axes once used on wood now raised for war, their voices rising in cries of defiance that blended with scripture as the reverend shouted verses not as prayer but as battle hymn, declaring that the meek would no longer bow. Bullets whined through the air, smashing glass, splintering wood, sending showers of dust and debris across the street. But the people of Dry Creek moved with purpose, firing from windows, rolling barrels into alleys, hurling stones from rooftops, even children throwing nails into the path of charging horses, every hand adding to the storm, every voice adding to the roar, until the outlaw gang found themselves surrounded not by silence, but by resistance as relentless as the desert wind. The outlaw leader stormed into the open street, his long coat flaring like wings of a crow, his revolver raised high, his curses booming louder than the shots of his men, his eyes locked on the sheriff standing calm in the dust. And though his mouth spat venom, his heart twisted with a fury that was equal parts fear and disbelief. For never in all his years had a town denied him. Never had silence transformed into such thunder. Never had prey bared its teeth with such ferocity. His men faltered at the edges, firing wildly into shadows that struck back with precision. Some stumbling on the hidden caltrops Jonas had scattered, others blinded by smoke from Elon's burning barrels, others struck by stones hurled from unseen rooftops, and their unity crumbled into fragments as shouts turned to curses, curses to screams, screams to silence, as one by one they fell or fled. The sheriff stepped further into the street, each stride slow, deliberate, his rifle steady, his face calm though sweat streaked his brow, his figure framed by the rising light of dawn and the curling smoke of battle. And in that moment, he became more than a man. He became the spine of the town itself, the embodiment of every whispered prayer, every silent night endured. Every lash of humiliation suffered beneath outlaw boots, and as his eyes met the outlaw leaders, the street between them seemed to narrow, the world itself holding its breath, all noise fading to a hum as destiny coiled tighter around their clash. For it was clear to all child and elder, outlaw and farmer alike, that Dry Creek's fate would be carved by the duel of these two men. But the battle around them did not pause. Bullets cracking into walls, smoke thickening in alleys, Clara's pistol snapping again as she drove another man back, Jonas swinging his hammer into the ribs of a fallen foe, Ellen shouting commands with a fire stronger than grief, Reverend Hale's bell tolling like war drums above. And though the gang fought hard, their spirit bent, their courage cracked, for they realized too late that this was no raid, no plunder, no drunken terror to scatter farmers. This was a war for survival. And the town they thought broken had risen as one body, one voice, one unshakable defiance. Still, the outlaw leader laughed through clenched teeth, raising his revolver toward the sheriff with a snarl. His men rallying faintly behind him, their shouts ragged, their eyes wild. And though fear gnawed at their hearts, pride still chained them to their guns. Pride that would drive them to slaughter or to victory. And as the sheriff tightened his grip, as smoke curled in ribbons across the pale light of morning, as dust swirled around their boots, the first act of the final reckoning thundered on, unstoppable, merciless, eternal. And Dry Creek, once a forgotten dot on the map, now stood ablaze in history's fire, its silence shattered forever by the storm of resistance that had broken free. Gunfire roared through Dry Creek like a storm unleashed, echoing off wooden walls and ricocheting down narrow alleys until the whole town seemed alive with the thunder of war. The pale dawn now smothered beneath curtains of smoke and the acrid stench of powder. Each shot punctuated by the cries of men struck down or the sharp gasps of townsfolk fighting for breath behind barricades. Jonas the blacksmith fought at the mouth of his forge, hammer slick with blood, his arms swinging in arcs born of decades at the anvil. Each blow landing with a crack that silenced jeers into gurgles, while his shotgun roared between strikes, the double-barreled blast tearing apart planks and ribs alike. His figure framed by sparks and embers from the dying forge, so that he seemed less man than titan forged of steel. Beside him, Ellen moved like a sentinel, fire devouring the timbers and sending black smoke spiraling upward, her voice rising above the chaos as she ordered men to roll more obstacles into place. Her tone steady as iron, even as bullets chipped the wood inches from her head. And though grief had once hollowed her, fury filled the gaps now, a widow no longer bowed but unbroken, wielding courage sharper than any blade. Clara, dirt smudged across her face, fired from behind a water trough until her pistol clicked empty, then scrambled for fallen rifles, her small hands awkward but determined as she loaded powder and ball with trembling precision, firing again and again, each recoil bruising her shoulder, yet driving her deeper into the rhythm of war. And when one outlaw lunged toward her with knife raised, she smashed the butt of the rifle into his jaw with a crack, his body slumping against the trough. And for the first time, she did not flinch at the blood that splattered across her skirt, for innocence had no place in a town clawing back its soul. In the chapel tower, Reverend Hale still pulled the bell rope, though his arms ached and palms bled raw, the great iron tongue striking with such fury that dust rained from the rafters, the tolls crashing like waves across the battlefield. but now he shouted between pulls. Scripture warped into rallying cries. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. His voice raw but defiant, carrying through smoke and fire. A hymn of battle that drove fear into the outlaws and breathed strength into the townsfolk. The sheriff advanced down the main street, his rifle cracking with every measured step. Each shot clean, deliberate, never wasted, dropping men as surely as a judge's gavel drops a sentence. His coat torn by splinters, his hat grazed by bullets, yet his stride unbroken. For he knew his presence itself was a weapon calm amid chaos, order amid madness, a beacon that held the town together. Around him, the alleys seethed with chaos, boys and old men raining stones from rooftops, women slashing at riders with knives from windows, horses rearing in panic as caltrops tore their hooves, and every corner became a trap, every shadow a strike. The town itself reshaped into a maze that swallowed the outlaws, one by one. Yet the gang fought with savage desperation, their revolvers flashing, their curses spilling, their fury lashing against the tide of resistance, and the streets grew slick with blood, the dust clumping into red mud beneath boots as bodies fell where they stood, cries of agony mingling with the crackle of fire spreading from Elon's burning barricades. One outlaw dragged himself across the dirt, clutching his side, only to be struck down by a stone hurled from above. Another tried to climb a ladder toward the bell tower, only for Reverend Hale to swing down with the weight of the rope, kicking the man back to the street below where he landed. And still others stumbled into alleys, only to find spikes waiting, their feet torn, their screams echoing in the confined spaces until gunfire silenced them. The outlaw leader moved like a shadow at the storm's heart, his revolver blazing, his coat flaring as he shouted orders, dragging his men by sheer force of will to hold their ground. His eyes locked constantly on the sheriff, as though every bullet was meant to carve a path to him. And though his voice boomed with rage, within it threaded the thin wire of desperation, for he saw his men faltering, saw their courage draining with every body that hit the dust. Yet pride lashed him forward, pride that would not let him retreat, pride that burned hotter than fear, though it consumed him just as surely. The sheriff fired again, the shot tearing through the brim of the leader's hat, spinning it into the dirt, and the two men froze for a heartbeat, their eyes meeting across smoke and blood, one burning with madness, the other steady with justice. And in that stare, the whole town seemed to pause, every heartbeat aligned with theirs, every scream and shot dimming beneath the weight of destiny pressing between them. But the moment shattered when gunfire cracked again from the alleys, when Jonas bellowed like thunder as he dropped another outlaw with his hammer, when Clara screamed defiance and fired point blank into the chest of a man who thought her weak, when Ellen hurled a stone that cracked against a rider's skull, when Reverend Hale's bell tolled so loud the very timbers trembled, and the war of Dry Creek surged forward with renewed ferocity, a tide of fire and steel that swept through every corner, every home, every alley, until the entire town was consumed by the storm, its people transformed from victims into warriors, its soil drunk with blood, its sky veiled in smoke, its silence long dead and buried beneath the roar of the last stand. The battle for Dry Creek burned hotter with every passing heartbeat. The narrow streets, now choked with smoke, so thick it clung to skin and stung eyes raw. The cries of the wounded mingling with the thunder of revolvers, until the whole town seemed swallowed by some hell-forged storm, its wooden bones groaning beneath the weight of fire and fury. The air thick with splinters, sparks, and the metallic temps of blood. And in that storm both sides fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant erasure. For the outlaws sensed their empire crumbling beneath them even as they spat curses and fired wildly, while the townsfolk, driven past fear into the ragged edge of rage, clung to the fight as if each strike and shot carved out another breath of freedom. Jonas swung his hammer again and again, his breath ragged, his arms trembling with exhaustion but still unyielding, the heavy iron ringing against skulls and ribs alike, sparks from the forge flashing across his sweat-slicked brow until his whole body gleamed like tempered steel. And when an outlaw's blade sank into his shoulder, he did not fall but bellowed, tearing the knife free with one hand and slamming his hammer down with the other, crushing the man into the dirt with a finality that sent shudders through all who saw. His resilience, a beacon that refused to dim. Ellen stumbled through smoke, face streaked with soot, eyes burning as she rolled another flaming barrel into a barricade where outlaws pressed hard, the explosion of heat forcing them back in chaos as tongues of fire climbed walls and roofs, sparks scattering upward like dying stars. And though she coughed blood into her handkerchief, she raised her chin and kept moving, every step fueled not by strength of body, but by will forged in grief, for she carried not only her own pain, but the weight of every widow, every child stripped by the gang's cruelty. And in that burden she found a strength deeper than fear. Clara, bruised and bloodied, crouched behind a shattered trough, firing until her rifle jammed, then drew a kitchen knife from her apron and slashed at the hand that reached for her, blood spraying as she scrambled to reload, her small frame shaking yet unbroken, her eyes hardened from girlhood into something sterner, a quiet flame that refused to die. And those who fought beside her drew courage from her defiance. For if a serving girl could spit in the face of death, then what excuse had any grown man to falter? Reverend Hale no longer rang the bellot's great tongue, now hung silent, cracked from his relentless tolling, but he had descended into the fray, brandishing the heavy brass cross torn from the chapel altar, his hands bleeding where the edges cut into his skin. Yet he swung it with the force of conviction, his voice hoarse from shouting prayers that sounded more like battle cries, his words turning scripture into thunder that rattled through the smoke. And men followed his charge, not because they believed in heaven, but because they saw heaven burning in his eyes. The sheriff pushed steadily forward, his coat torn and blackened, his rifle steady in his hands. Every shot measured, every step deliberate, each movement stripping another outlaw from the earth. And though bullets whined past his ears, though splinters gouged his cheek, he did not break stride, for he knew his calm presence was the keystone holding the town together, the center around which chaos found order. And as he advanced, the townsfolk moved with him, emboldened, their scattered skirmishes knitting into a tide that pressed the gang back street by street, alley by alley, house by house. Yet the outlaw leader was no shadow shrinking from light. He was fire made flesh, his revolvers blazing, his coat snapping with every stride, his voice roaring commands that lashed his men into obedience even as their courage crumbled. His eyes locked on the sheriff through smoke and ruin, as if all the fury of his life had found its mark in that single figure, and he carved a path through bodies to close the distance, his boots striking sparks in blood-soaked dust, his pride and rage burning hotter than the flames devouring the town. Around them, the world dissolved into madness, horses screaming as they collapsed in alleys, walls groaning as fire consumed beams, roofs caving in under the weight of flame, gunpowder barrels exploding in bursts that shook the ground, men grappling in the mud until knives found throats, women striking from windows with hatchets, children hurling stones from rooftops, every soul caught in the storm, either giving or taking blood. And yet through it all, two figures drew nearer, the sheriff with his quiet certainty, the outlaw leader with his storm of rage, their orbits pulling them closer with every breath, until the chaos itself seemed to bend around them, narrowing the battlefield into a stage where destiny would soon demand its final act. Still, they fought through the tide, the sheriff's rifle cracking with precision, the leader's revolvers roaring with fury, both men leaving trails of bodies in their wake, the gap shrinking step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, until only a few yards of smoke and death separated them, the air between heavy with the weight, every prayer, every ounce of blood spilled, as if the whole town held its breath, waiting for the collision that would decide whether Dry Creek lived or died. The streets of Dry Creek fell into a terrible hush, as if the very earth itself had drawn breath and held it, the storm of gunfire dimming to scattered cracks, the screams thinning into hoarse whispers, the fire crackling louder than rifles now. And at the heart of that scorched silence, two figures emerged from the smoke, each step deliberate, heavy with the weight of lives already lost, the sheriff striding with calm gravity, rifle lowered but ready, his hat brim shadowing eyes sharp as flint, his coat torn and soot-stained, yet his posture unbroken, while opposite him the outlaw leader advanced like a beast cornered, revolvers gleaming in fists that trembled not from fear but from the feral energy of a man who had carved his life from violence and would not lay it down quietly, his face streaked with grime, lips twisted into a sneer that masked the deep fracture of desperation running beneath, his boots grinding over bodies that had once been his men but were now nothing more than stones along the path to vengeance. The whole town seemed to shrink back, townsfolk clutching rifles yet holding fire, women dragging children into doorways, Jonas staggering to lean on his hammer as blood ran down his arm but refusing to turn away, Ellen pressing her soot-blackened hand to her chest as though to steady a heart beating too fast, Clara clutching her knife with knuckles white but frozen in place, Reverend Hale whispering scripture under his breath as if to sanctify what was about to unfold, and all eyes fixed on the two men whose orbits had drawn them inexorably to this collision, justice and anarchy embodied in flesh and bone, destined to decide in blood what no court or sermon could. Dust swirled between them in ghostly eddies, ash fluttering down like gray snow, the air shimmering with heat from flames crawling hungrily along rooftops. and for a moment neither moved, their stares locked. The sheriff's steady gaze carrying the weight of duty, of promises made to the dead, while the outlaw's eyes blazed with wounded pride and rage. The fury of a man who had ruled by fear, and now saw fear slip away from him, each heartbeat stretching long and thin, a taut string ready to snap. Then the leader barked a curse and raised his revolvers, twin barrels flashing like fangs. The sheriff dropping low as the first shot screamed past his ear, dirt spraying in his wake as he rolled and returned fire. The crack of his rifle answering the roar of the pistols, sparks leaping where bullets struck stone, wood splintering, echoes rattling off every wall so that the whole town trembled beneath their duel, each shot carving scars into the earth, each miss too close for breath, until the street itself seemed to cry out beneath the fury of their exchange. The leader pressed forward, firing wild but fast, forcing the sheriff back with sheer volume, his laughter harsh, manic, a broken hymn to chaos. Yet the sheriff wasted no bullet, each pull of the trigger deliberate, each step back calculated, his mind a map of angles and timing, waiting for the opening that always came when rage outran discipline. The crowd gasping as shots sparked inches from his chest, as wood shattered near his head, as firelight painted his face in flashes of orange and shadow. But he never faltered, never let his eyes leave his foe. Blood streaked the leader's arm as one bullet grazed him, spinning him half a step, but he roared and steadied himself, spitting into the dirt before lunging forward again, his boots slamming into the dust, revolvers roaring until smoke curled from the barrels, his figure half ghost, half demon in the haze. And though his bullets tore splinters from door frames and carved scars into walls, none found the heart of the man he hunted, for the sheriff moved with the precision of a blade honed by years, his rifle barking only when it must, each shot driving the leader back into the narrow funnel of the street. Silence fell between volleys, broken only by the ragged breaths of the duelists and the groans of the dying around them. And in that silence, the townsfolk felt the gravity of what they witnessed, as though time itself had slowed to honor the weight of history being written in gunpowder and blood. The leader staggered but did not fall, snarling as he drew a hidden knife from his boot and hurled it, spinning through smoke, the blade flashing toward the sheriff's chest, but the lawman twisted, the knife grazing his coat and burying itself into a post with a thud that shuddered through the crowd. And before the leader could fire again, the sheriff's rifle cracked, the shot grazing the outlaw's shoulder, spinning him halfway, blood spraying across the dust in a fine mist. Yet still he did not yield. Instead, stumbling forward with guttural roar, his revolvers flaring until one clicked empty, then the other, his curses louder than the gunfire, his desperation laid bare in every ragged breath, every stumble forward, until at last he stood only a dozen paces away, chest heaving, blood soaking his sleeve, smoke coiling around him like the shroud of a dying king. The sheriff lifted his rifle, sight steady, but did not fire, his voice low, yet cutting through the smoke. "It ends here." The leader spat blood into the dust, lips curling into a grin even as his knees buckled. And with a final surge of fury, he raised his empty revolver as though defiance itself could load the chambers. But before his finger could tighten, the sheriff's rifle barked one last time. the cracks splitting the silence, the bullets striking true. The outlaw leader's body jerking back as though yanked by unseen strings, his revolver clattering into the dirt, his sneer frozen in shock as he collapsed onto his knees. Then forward into the blood-soaked dust, his life spilling out into the earth that had long awaited his debt. For a heartbeat, the world remained still, the smoke curling upward, the flames crackling hungrily, the sheriff lowering his rifle with hands steady, though his heart thundered, the townsfolk staring in silence at the fallen man who had haunted them for so long. And then, slowly, as if afraid to break the spell, a cheer rose, ragged at first, then louder, voices uniting in relief and triumph, echoing through the ruins of the town as the sheriff stood over the body of the outlaw, justice at last carved into the dust of Dry Creek.